planning virtual meetings and conferences. I am joined today by my fabulous colleagues, Carly Schmidt, Merrick Guxton, Katie Murphy, and Deanna Toledo. We are very excited to engage with you today on our experience as we ran Virtual River Rally. So just quickly, in case, hopefully you've all used Zoom by now, but there are just a couple of things that we wanted to make sure that we went over. As I mentioned, there were 150 people registered for this event today. We currently have about half of that joining us. And so because we only have an hour, we want to provide as much information in the most efficient way as possible. So we will be doing a lot of presenting to you. However, we're going to try to use as many opportunities as we can to engage you. So I would encourage you to make sure that your chat box is opened. We would love for you to go ahead and introduce yourselves through the chat box. So if you could please include your name and your organization, and if you want where you're joining us from today, we would love to have that information. And again, the chat box, everything that is said publicly will be used to help us compile a resource for you following this meeting, because we imagine that there are going to be a lot of ideas shared. We're hoping that you'll share your ideas with us just as much as we're going to share with you, as well as questions asked that we're just simply not going to have the time to get to. However, we are going to use the chat box and the questions that come in to answer those questions offline, and we'll email this resource to you after the fact, as well as with a link to the recording and a lot of different resources that we're going to be touching on today. So thank you to the folks who are taking the opportunity to introduce themselves through the chat box. Very much appreciate it and really excited to have you here today. We do want to make sure that we're providing great information to our network and our members, so please feel free to complete the evaluation at the end of this webinar, so that helps us to improve what we're providing to you. And we are going to go ahead and get a poll just out there to see what's going on with you guys, kind of why you're joining us. So there should be a poll on your screen that asks you several questions. One is, are you planning a virtual event right now? Which would mean that this webinar is very resonates with you a lot. The other is just determining the length of your event. And then finally, how many participants are you anticipating? That kind of helps us to gauge whether or not we need to focus more on kind of third-party platforms, or if you're going to have more questions just based on the usage of things like Google Meets or Zoom. So most of the votes are coming in. It looks like about 40% of folks are planning a virtual event right now. If you go ahead and complete that poll, I will end it and put the results up on the screen for you all to see. So here are the results from the poll. It looks like the majority of you, like I said, are planning a virtual event right now. Multiple days seems to be quite popular, although there are folks that are thinking about maybe just a little less than a half a day event. And then how many participants are you anticipating? Folks are looking like they're going to have a larger crowd. So folks that are going to need various ways to engage and ways for you to engage them in the process. Again, for those that didn't hear before, we are recording this session. And so we will be having this as a resource on our website as a follow-up. So thank you for those that have already introduced yourselves and your organization, where you're going. Today is going to be a kind of a jam-packed session of all things related to planning a virtual conference and event. Feel free to have your cameras on if you so choose. We are going to talk about various aspects of planning a virtual event, give you a brief overview of how we went about planning our 3-week river rally, and then dive in a little deeper on what planning an event of that scale looks like, the finances needed, engaging your speakers and your sponsors, and then finally, what does implementing the event look like, and our own shared experience. And again, at any time, please feel free to ask questions or share your own experiences with hosting virtual events in the chat box. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Carly.
Thanks, Brenna. So my name is Carly. I am the membership associate here at River Network. And before we dive right into the details of our experience with River Rally, I want to provide a very high-level overview of what the event looked like. So we started to hear about COVID and events being canceled at the beginning of March, and River Rally was scheduled for May. So we were launched into a complete overhaul of this event and actually had very little time to make the shift to virtual happen because we did want to keep our original event date. So we were one of the first organizations in 2020 to take this event virtual, and it was quite the learning experience. While the planning process was insane and all-consuming for those months, the event was ultimately so wonderful. We got many notes of appreciation and kudos, and we learned a lot from this experience. So excited to share with you all today. So here I'll just share kind of a top-level overview of what the event looked like if you were not able to join us in May and June. So this slide here shows the landing page attendees saw when they logged into the event. This site is called vConference, and we used it to organize conference content. We were able to display sponsor logos prominently on the page, and the main navigation would take you to River Rally live sessions, the chat room, and also our library of pre-recorded workshop content. So vConference served to organize conference content and let attendees know what was coming up next. All live session virtual rooms would link out to a Zoom meeting. Our panel conversations were also linked out as Zoom webinars. Next slide, please, Brenna. So we had 538 people registered for Virtual River Rally. As you can see from, sorry, I'm getting a bit of feedback here. If you could keep yourself on mute.
Thank you.
Okay, so the virtual program, 538 people registered for Virtual River Rally. You can see from the bar chart here that this number is pretty on par with what we experienced for the last in-person rally, although we didn't quite see the growth that we've typically been seeing year to year. The virtual program ran for 3 weeks and highlighted 2 of our 6 themes per week. The intention of this prolonged program was to kind of consolidate relevant content for attendees, and the structure also made it very easy to assign 2 to 3 staff members to each week's program. Rally workshops were either live via Zoom or pre-recorded for on-demand viewing. Our live workshop attendance ranged from 12 to 120 attendees. And in an effort to give folks the networking time that they can usually expect from River Rally, we planned 6 social events in the evenings a few times a week. These events were wonderful, but had lower attendance than we expected. We scheduled happy hours once a week at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, and we heard from or from many of our East Coast attendees that 8 to 9 p.m. was just too late for them. But the film nights in particular were very great and very well attended. Next slide, please, Brenna. Great. So now that you know a little bit more about kind of the end result that was River Rally, we can dive into planning. So we put together a little pre-planning checklist based on what we learned from this experience. So first and foremost, identify your audience and survey your community. Ask them what they're looking for from this event and use the information to guide all other planning. A survey will also help you gauge interest in a virtual event and really get a feel for what people need during this time. And if a survey via newsletter or your website is not really getting traction, maybe you'll also consider getting on the phone with these folks and having those conversations that way. Second, define your goals and consider staff capacity. So it's ideal at the outset to clearly define what you want this virtual event to be, and also decide what aspects of the typical in-person event you want to prioritize here. Also going hand in hand with defining your goals is taking a look at staff capacity and clearly defining roles and expectations for staff. So presumably the transition to virtual is a new experience for staff and roles are inevitably going to change. You might recognize that there are gaps in existing staff knowledge and decide that you need to bring in a contractor for this event. The process is new to everyone, so providing some clarity around what this undertaking means will be really important. Consider accessibility and overall inclusiveness of the event. So for example, Zoom has an audio transcription feature that allows people to read the transcript from a meeting recording. At Rally, we also provided call-in information for folks with limited or no internet access, and providing the slides in advance would have also been a really good idea here. But there are a host of other components to consider in order to make the event more equitable, and there's a lot of resources out there. And these considerations really need to be folded in at the very beginning when you're considering what technology to use and how to schedule this event. And finally, of course, plan your budget, and Katie's going to talk about this in a few minutes. Next slide, please. Great. So one of the first decisions you will have to make is what tools you will use to take your event virtual. You might need meeting or web conferencing software and conference platforms, but it's very possible that you do not need both. Your primary tool for bringing your attendees together is going to be your web conferencing tool. This is how you're going to host interactive meetings and have discussions and get your event content out there. With your meeting software, be sure to overestimate the number of attendees you expect per session, and this will also factor into pricing and budgeting. Meeting security is also an issue these days, so consider how these meetings are, how secure these meetings are, especially if you're promoting on social media or maybe a less secure web page. And after you decide on your meeting software, you can decide if you need a separate conference platform to organize your workshop schedule, promote sponsors, or manage a discussion forum. So if you're unsure about whether or not you need a conference platform, be sure to really weigh all of your options, because there's a lot of room for creativity here. So instead of hosting your event on a huge and expensive platform, consider whether a simple web page or Facebook group would provide the connectivity you're looking for within your audience. And it really just depends on your audience. A conference platform might seem like a great idea, but might also be too much for staff to manage, and that's where kind of staff capacity considerations will really come into play. Kind of in that same vein, if you're making all of these technology decisions, consider whether you should bring in a contractor to assist with the platform setup and management. So for River Rally, we brought in 2 contractors to, they uploaded pre-recorded content to the platform, they managed registrant credentials, and helped us with live streaming and a host of other tasks. But I will also mention that the contractors were only necessary because our conference platform was not user-friendly on the back end, which was really something we should have considered at the outset. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, the transition to virtual River Rally happened very quickly. One back, Brenna, thanks. It happened very quickly, and we weren't really able to dig deep and identify and test what aspects of a conference platform were really important to us. And again, we used the vConference platform, but there are many other options out there. So we figured out a little too late that vConference did not provide the level of interactivity that we were really looking for from a conference platform. So at the outset, when you're defining your goals and priorities for this event, be sure to consider how your technology tools will help you achieve your goals and your ultimate vision for what this virtual event looks like. So for example, interactivity is a huge part of River Rally, but when we got into the platform, we realized how clunky the chats were, which was really disappointing. So I recommend considering how important attendee interactivity is to you and being sure that the platform has the functionality you're looking for. Even more important than interactivity, I think, is how easy it is for attendees to find and access upcoming events. I think the most important thing to consider here when organizing event content is kind of the clarity around where content lives and how and when attendees can access content. The easier it is for attendees to use, the better. And also because of our rush timeline, we weren't really able to dig into the conference platform and decide if it was the best option for us. So if the time is there and available to you, I highly recommend demoing whichever platform you're considering with a group of staff to make sure you have all the features you need. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to keep harping on this, but your first communication when you're announcing the virtual event should involve some kind of survey of your community or your audience. So what you learn from the survey will really inform your event schedule and programs to start collecting that information immediately at the outset. With regard to virtual event promotion, we found it very helpful to boil down our vision for Virtual River Rally and what exactly we were promoting through this vision into 10-ish bullet points for staff to refer back to. This was especially important because of the short turnaround. We were kind of, still in the brain of promoting the in-person event. So this was super helpful for not only staff who weren't very involved in planning, but for those of us who were, working on this every day. We went back to these talking points quite a bit during the promotion period. Also, having a shared calendar was helpful for our marketing manager and others to track the timing of communications and how they coincided with certain deadlines. Also consider how you will communicate with event participants during the event. Virtual River Rally was a 3-week program, so we landed on bi-weekly emails to remind folks to log into the conference platform and check out upcoming events. I realize that's probably not super relevant for you if you're having just a one-off meeting, but considering how folks need to be reminded about what is going on for this event will be really important. Typically, your in-person event would also have a photographer or staff person responsible for capturing some highlights. So we decided, with permission from our audience, to take screenshots of our Zoom meetings or peer calls to capture what was going on at Rally. And we ended up with a lot of screenshots like the one you see on this slide. Also, because all content was recorded, we have about 100 hours of content that we're working on leveraging into a short Rally highlights video. So just kind of think creatively about what tools you can use to promote the virtual event or to reflect on it as well. Finally, we recommend that you limit offline engagement opportunities during the event. We tried a couple of things to get folks engaged outside of the regular Zoom workshops like Rally Bingo and photo contests, but I think ultimately this created too much noise. I will mention too that one initiative that really took off that was kind of unexpected was a chat group about virtual birding. It was really the only chat that remained active through the 3-week conference, and it was super fun to check in with a group about what birds folks were seeing in their local areas. So obviously we don't have the exact recipe for what gets people fired up to communicate and kind of engage offline, but I would think that your community survey would help you a little bit in that respect. So that's it for me, and I'll turn it over to Merrick.
Great. Well, my name is Merrick. I'm the logistical coordinator for River Rally. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the content and how we transitioned it from the program that we had pretty well developed when we decided to transition in March. So we had the standard content we were planning for the live meeting was plenary sessions where you have everyone in the ballroom. We had a bunch of concurrent workshop sessions that were typically 90 minutes. We also had a version of that included 10 to 15-minute lightning round sessions. So to craft a virtual event, we had 3 different styles. We had pre-recorded sessions, we had live sessions that were just streamed on Zoom, and then we have what we call simulated live, which is actually pre-recorded, but we had it scheduled, we had it on the platform, and sort of watched the pre-recorded presentation together and gave the presenters and attendees the opportunity to engage over chat. And this, we were a little skeptical about that, but that ended up being sort of the most engaging experience because you have complete control over the recording. You don't have to stress about any technology that's not going to cooperate with you in the moment. And the presenters can sort of answer questions as they come, and it made for a really interesting experience. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So I had a list of workshop presenters who had been selected to present in San Antonio. And we had to communicate with all of them and give them 3 options essentially. We had a calendar set up. They could schedule a time to meet with us and record their presentation. They could defer the presentation to next year, which at that point in time we had decided we were going to try to go back to San Antonio in 21. So a lot of groups that had regionally specific topics, there were, showcasing something in Texas, and a lot of presenters who had really engaging interactive workshops opted to sort of, let's put this on hold and come back and talk again next year. Or we had a few people who just were crazy busy and life was unpredictable this year. They just opted out altogether. So the people who chose to record, again, most of the sessions in person were planned to be 90-minute workshops, which is a really long time to be sitting at the computer watching a video. So our goal was to get those recordings down into 45 to 60-minute sessions. And we set up some best practices that we shared with all the presenters to sort of walk them through tips to make the virtual presentation engaging and keep people watching by themselves interested and paying attention. Another thing that we did that sort of happened organically, it wasn't a conscious shift, but it had a really great, powerful effect, was we shifted some of the plenary topics that we had coordinated with the panels and some keynote speakers. They became really topical conversations. And so being able to sort of pivot that and focus on some of the current issues that were affecting everybody was really powerful for this community. Next slide. So when we scheduled the windows to do the recordings with the presenters, like I said, our goal was a 45-minute video, but we set up a 90-minute window to do this presentation. Now, Zoom, at this point in time, Zoom was kind of new to a lot of people, so we wanted to make sure there was plenty of time for all the presenters to get online, get comfortable with the functionality of the platform, and walk through all of the logistics for the presentation together. So I will note that for the traditional workshops, we scheduled 90 minutes, and that seemed to be plenty of time for everybody. For the lightning rounds, which we were aiming for 10 to 15-minute videos, we only scheduled 30-minute windows, and that consistently was not quite enough time. So I would recommend plan on at least 30 minutes of a cushion to sort of integrate everybody, and no matter what your end goal is, just plan on having a half hour to sort of get everyone settled in. For the recordings, we also assigned each presenter or presentation group River Network staff member to sort of coordinate with them, host the recording, introduce them, and then be online and available to support as needed throughout the recording process. And so to prepare, we did create some videos that there's links in the resources that we'll share that just sort of outlined, walked through, this is how we're going to do this, this is what the end goal is going to be. And like I said, we generated some best practices for presenting in a virtual environment. We also sent a master PowerPoint template to presenters to either customize with their content or paste in their own slides, but keeping the introduction and then the final slides branded with River Network for River Rally, and then we had some communication and logistical information that we wanted to be consistent. And so having everybody use the same PowerPoint slide was helpful. And then we also created a script and a checklist for our recording staff hosts to use, which sort of streamlined the process for everybody involved as well. And those PDFs are ready to share with you along with the other resources from this presentation too. So let's go on to the next. The live sessions we did, we had at least 2, maybe 3 engagements a day. And this was plenary sessions where we had a keynote speaker or a panel conversation online. Some of our workshops turned into live engagements. We could use breakout functionality in Zoom and really engage people in topics that they were interested in connecting on. And similarly to the recordings, we had a River Network staff person assigned to each group to moderate their session. So we had one person kind of coordinating with the speakers, and they were on screen during the session. And we always had another staff member online to support behind the scenes. So monitoring the chat functions, helping people with technical issues if they couldn't get online. And that was a really critical role because you never know what's going to come up. So just having someone available to handle those things behind the scenes was helpful. Depending on the presenters and sort of the goal of the session, some of our sessions used the Zoom webinar format and some of them used a meeting format. And we really found that in one of the platforms, you could sort of accommodate all of the needs for any of the presenters. We really ultimately had to do some heavy learning on the Zoom technical front, but once we got our heads around it as a staff, it worked out to be a really productive format for us. And then lastly, we had two different options to sort of share the live events on the conference platform. We could stream it through the conference platform, which means as an attendee, you would log into the conference platform and view it in that screen. That ultimately, we had some delays with that, and it just wasn't quite as seamless as we want. So we ended up sort of pivoting and sharing the Zoom link and having people join the Zoom directly. And that worked out really well too. So I think my last slide is going to be talking about scheduling. So our attendees were in 6 different time zones, which is quite a lot to consider. And Carly mentioned we had some issues trying to meet people's needs at both ends of the day. Somebody getting up online in California, 8 a.m. kind of feels early to be engaging with people. And at the other end of the day, 8 p.m. feels late on the East Coast to be engaging. So just think about that and try to figure out how you can keep it reasonable for everybody. We tried to set a schedule and stay consistent with our start times throughout the 3 weeks that we hosted the live engagements. I think that was helpful just for people's planning and decision-making processes. And then when you are trying to schedule the content, we had conference themes that sort of dictate the tracks that our workshops fall in, and that's going virtually was a different thing to manage. So we sort of coordinated thematically each week the content, and which helped with promotion and planning and engagement. And then last thing I just want to mention is Zoom fatigue is a real thing. So think about how people are feeling after they're sitting at the computer for hours. Make sure you leave breaks in between your sessions so people can relax and recover, take a bio break. Yeah, so I think those are our main tips for scheduling content.
Great, thanks, Merrick. So we have a question up on the screen, and certainly encourage you all to answer it through the chat box. What other elements of planning virtual events have you found helpful through your own experiences? So those that you've either attended or you've already hosted, what can you share with the group for the overall good of the group? If you can share some of your answers and questions in the chat box, greatly appreciate it. And I know we have some questions that are coming in around length of breaks and length of the event, which the River Network team are answering. So that was, that's really helpful. Thank you. So while we are waiting for you guys to come on in and answer or share any of your ideas, let's go ahead and keep going so that we have enough time to carry forward. So Katie?
Sure, thanks Brenna. My name is Katie Murphy and I'm based in Boulder, Colorado. I'm our Director of Philanthropy. And I wanted to talk about our experiencing managing the financial aspects of a virtual conference. And we'll start us off just with a quick background on Rally before moving into the revenue aspect of our financial piece, and then the expense aspect of Rally. So first, just a bit of background is River Rally is considered a key program of River Network. So it is a way in which we fulfill our mission through the programming and community that we offer at Rally. And this has a few key important impacts on how we see and perceive this event. The first is that it's really not a big fundraiser for us. We really seek to cover our expenses each year and end up a little in the black. The second is that we do seek to and have been quite successful historically in building in some funding for this conference into our grants and into our contracts. So some of our conference revenue is secured over a year, sometimes closer to 2 years before an event. In terms of our revenue sources, about a third is earned revenue, so that's through our registration fees. About 2/3 is through scholarships and sponsorships, and 1% through in an in-person event, SWAG, this year in an online context that was eliminated. Beyond embedding scholarship and sponsorship revenue into our grants, we really begin fundraising in earnest each year about 6 months out and typically close 6 weeks before the conference. Next slide, Brenna. So what that meant for us this year was, as Carly mentioned, in terms of the timing of our transition, is that we really shifted to virtual after we had already stopped pursuing new prospects. The focus of our work was a few key things then. The first was to adjust benefits offerings from an in-person event to the online environment. So for that, we really looked at what we had originally offered and then looked at what the platform allowed and tried our best to parallel benefits and where we could add more. Obviously, I think a virtual context provides some freedom, some new space for creativity, and some low cost or free ways to acknowledge your sponsors. The second was to transition our committed sponsors. So sponsors had signed up based upon benefits in an in-person context that we could no longer offer. So we really needed to both ask permission and really get them on board with the benefits that were in the virtual space that looked as compelling or more than they did in person. All of our secured sponsors warmly and quickly responded to shift and reaffirmed their commitment. On our third point here, working to close remaining prospects, we did have a handful of local prospects that we were working to close at the time that we decided to transition to virtual. All of those dropped. That was not a surprise to us. I think that, local sponsors are compelled by the location of the event. They're one of the more challenging funders to retain if you are in the place of shifting your event. And obviously, if you are planning from the outset a virtual event, I would suggest that these are going to be more challenging ones to secure. There are more opportunities with more national brands or national entities. And finally was to work with our sponsors to tailor their benefits to the virtual space. So we did in our NV conference have more options than we needed. It's quite a powerful platform and in fact sort of vendor focused. And so we were, it was sort of focused on and had a lot of bells and whistles around acknowledging and promoting entities. And we chose many fewer options than were available to us, just understanding our sponsors, the lift that we perceived they might want to have with buying into this new platform, and just the relative size of our event and the relative exposure opportunity that Rally provides. Next slide, Brenna. So we found that there were a number of upsides with virtual events for sponsors. The first is increased exposure. So typically with River Rally, sponsors are acknowledged, in our promotion online prior to the event. And then when you're in the actual event and printed materials, some elect to have booths and have a physical presence, but primarily they're static materials. Online, it's a much more dynamic space and more potential for logo exposure than you have in person, as you can think about having logos throughout the site when you log in, while watching a video, other things that we'll go into in a minute. The second is trackable metrics. So obviously in an in-person environment, you can't say this number of people looked at your logo on the wall, this many people looked at your logo on page 5 of the conference program, etc. So we have back-end metrics around page views and clicks, and can kind of report back to our funders and are right now as we gear up for Rally 2021 to look at and to promote sort of what that exposure looked like to potential sponsors. The third is around potential for increased number of attendees. I think this really varies for each event. For us, we did have a modest increase. I think that you do have the opportunity, obviously, with less travel costs, less time commitment, more ability to integrate a conference into somebody's day-to-day, the opportunity to engage more folks. Next is lower participant cost equals more scholarships. So for folks who provide this to your attendees, this was a really exciting win for us. We reduced our registration cost, as I'm sure many folks are considering. And that was, we had already secured scholarship funds. So we were able to go back to those scholarship funders and let them know in many cases that we had doubled or even more the number of scholarships that we were able to provide folks. Sponsor attendance at event. So obviously many sponsors don't take the time to, wouldn't have taken the time to fly to San Antonio and attend a 3-day event. Typically we have very low attendance amongst our sponsors. We did provide free attendance for each sponsor, 1 or 2, depending on their sponsorship levels, and many logged in and were able to, at their leisure, engage and take a scroll around the site, see how they were, their exposure looked on the site, and then to see some of the sessions and understand some of the content and what Rally is all about. In terms of acknowledgement options, so like I mentioned, logo placement, there's a lot of opportunities for this. We embedded this on the site, on the homepage, on certain themes, on the program, and we have a report that follows that will be coming out in the next few weeks. I think it's a really effective way that sponsors can see themselves on the site. And we offered opportunities for them to attach themselves to themes that they cared about and that were really relevant to the work that we do together or the work that they do. That pertains to event and session naming. So for example, typically we might have a happy hour sponsored by Anheuser-Busch or Coca-Cola, who are 2 funders of River Networks. And we did the same with our happy hour evening social events. Shout outs, so there's the opportunity to do verbal shout outs of sponsors at the top of sessions. If appropriate, there's a possibility if your funder is engaged in that topical area, and if it's kind of authentic to your partnership and your work together, to engage as speakers or active participants in the conference. This piece is sponsor exhibit hall. So as I mentioned, our platform was sort of geared towards vendors and towards creating space for folks to go through an exhibit hall and to visit different vendor, quote unquote, booths. So we had sponsor booths that folks could go visit that had, if folks are familiar with the platform, you might have seen videos and about a certain sponsor's CSR or certain sponsors' products that they're selling. That ultimately, our sponsors were incredibly excited about it. They loved the way that it looked. It was very easy for them to share that content with us. It was not, when we looked at our page hits, it was not a very well-visited portion of the site. So we would certainly rethink how to do more integrated sponsor exposure in a future virtual conference. And then Carly mentioned parallel communications. So really thinking about how you can utilize those as an opportunity to acknowledge your sponsors. Next slide. Yeah, so next we just wanted to hear from you. What are some ways to acknowledge or engage sponsors? That might be things that you've done that have been really successful. And this is within the virtual context. Sorry, it doesn't mention that. What's worked well for you, what you are thinking about, what you're planning right now.
And Katie, while we're waiting for folks to put any of their experiences into the chat box, we did have a question if we received any feedback from our sponsors about what they considered the most valued benefit to be during the event.
That's a good question. I would say the booths are what we received the best feedback on, which as I mentioned is sort of ironic because they did look and present really, really well. But again, it just wasn't something that I thought put our attendees in touch with some of the work that, or so that they could get to know our sponsors.
Okay, and then one of the ideas that we've had come in is give them time during quote unquote commercial breaks to talk about their services. So if sponsors attend events and we've got breaks coming up, maybe we can ask them to talk about what they're doing.
Cool.
Yeah, keep those ideas coming. I'm going to keep us going, Katie, just for timing's sake.
Yep, great. Yep, so next is around registration pricing. I know this is a high in everybody's minds right now around what is appropriate in a virtual context. It is not the same as what is appropriate for an in-person context most of the time. So from the high level picture, setting expectations on your registration revenue, you know, like I mentioned, you might be able to draw in more attendees. We did marginally, but you likely need to reduce your registration price. For us, that was roughly halving it. For us, we changed overall the revenue that we pulled in. We had expected 150K. Ultimately, it was 80K or less, so about halved the revenue that we brought in. From the registration cost point of view, just in terms of the different parameters that we assessed, we looked at the norms that are out there around online conferences, multi-day, and I think those norms are emerging as we move forward. There are many more multi-day conferences now than there were in March when we were looking at the landscape. Then look at the original, or if yours is an annual event, the typical cost of your in-person event. Are you offering more or less value for an in-person or for a virtual event? So looking at how your participants and just thinking from their point of view, how do they value the transition to a virtual context? Is there more or less content, et cetera? And finally, just assessing from your overall financial picture, what do you need to raise to offset expenses? And so where do you need to set that registration price in a comfortable place? Next slide.
Laura didn't tell you to bring her lunch for lunch.
And if we could just have folks mute, I hear a little bit of background noise. So just some key things to consider. Define your internal team. So really important, things move really quickly, particularly if you're in the place of transitioning in any event planning, things move quickly. So meet weekly, make sure folks are clear on their roles and responsibilities, have systems in place to organize and track your efforts. Communicate with your sponsors. I can't say enough how much you want to make sure you have clear, consistent communication. They're talking to the same person or they're talking to the same people. You're making that lift or that transition easy and straightforward for them. Again, we talked about this, Carly did, understand your platform. There's going to be pluses and minuses, know what those are, and really tailor how you're going to promote sponsors based upon the relative benefits they have. Zoom, if you're just using Zoom, there are absolutely many opportunities to promote sponsors within that. Consider your attendees. So we were aware that we did not want to over promote. We did not want to place sponsor logos and do shout outs at the top of every presentation. That felt like overkill. That was the right call. I think it's unappealing for participants to consistently be marketed to.
Hey, Coach. Okay, come in here.
Next is think outside the box. Obviously, like I mentioned, get creative. There's an opportunity to be creative in this new space. So how can you think about promoting sponsors in a new way? Could you do a river cleanup event sponsored by a local corporation where folks have an outside activity to be engaged with, other things like that.
Okay.
And follow up with sponsors. So convey gratitude, share successes, and do it, you know, within a few weeks. For us, we sent out an email that had key metrics and a thank you video from our president about 3 weeks after, to thank them and to acknowledge the successes of Virtual Rally. Next slide. So moving into expense, I think that there is typically a perception that virtual is cheaper. Certainly some costs will be reduced or eliminated. Travel, facilities, field trips, expenses, etc. That is true, and ours went from a budget of about 150K to 0. But what do you need to spend money on instead? New technology, a platform, upgrading Zoom, were two significant expenses for us, and contractual expenses as well. As Carly mentioned, that we engaged contractors and our budget increased significantly for those. And then of course, staff time for the things that we do in-house and obviously for managing contractors. Next slide. Here are some questions that we went through when we thought through the budgeting process, looking at the technical, and I'll just go through these quickly, cognizant of time. Look at the technical components, consider the costs of those. Your meeting software, for us, we transitioned to Zoom at this time organizationally, and that was a cost for us to both transition and then to upgrade. And then for your speakers as well. Will you need help implementing or customizing your software? Think about the cost of your contractors. Do you need a virtual conference platform to organize multiple meetings and events? Looking at your different range of options amongst those. And then when the total cost is laid out again, looking at what your expected attendance are, what your registration fee is, and really seeing what's feasible within those, as well as your internal staff capacity. Next one. Thanks. So again, this is last slide here, and this is really around staffing. This is a big piece, a big part of planning your virtual event. The staff time associated with a virtual event is quite significant. It is not less time. For us, obviously, it was more time because we had already gone through a lot of staff time to plan the in-person event. For us, it was also spread out over a longer period. Instead of 3 days an event, it was 3 weeks. And so just to consider the duration of that as well. For us, it was really important to meet early on to understand the event needs, our capacity, what we needed to get smart on and do in-house, and Merrick's mentioned that included Zoom, what we couldn't do in-house, and that was what we eventually contracted out for. And then obviously being cognizant of your resources relative to those decisions that you're making. And then as you are moving forward in the planning process, you know, there's the planning fallacy that we always think that things will take less time than they actually do. So just being aware of that and touching base with your team and understanding and responding to things that are stressing, obviously in some cases, acute stressors on certain staff positions, and how can you respond to that? And additionally, when you're making your, when you're contracting out, do you have flexibility in those contracts to add hours, to add services? And really keeping those open channels of communication. And that's the conclusion of my slides.
All right. So this is Deanna Toledo. I'll wrap it up here with just a few comments about the actual implementation of the event. So not to rehash any of the information you already heard, but obviously the content was quite diverse. We used the meetings, Zoom webinars, live recorded content, et cetera, et cetera. Our assumption going in was that participants would not block out 3 entire days for Rally as they would for the in-person session. So that contributed to our decision to spread it out over 3 weeks. I think in retrospect, we would not recommend doing that. It was a huge strain on our staff. And I would say you can see in terms of the participation, so the program, we got over 1,000 participants per week for the live content because we were not asking people to choose across simultaneous sessions. It was a lot higher than it would have been for the in-person event. But the participation did decrease 21% from week 1 to week 2, 27% from week 2 to week 3. Now, all of those sessions were recorded and are available on the website. So we're tracking how many people are actually going in. They'll be available through, I think, the next week. But definitely there was a drop off, you know, and has been every week since, of how many people are still going to the conference site. The social events had a lot lower participation, as we said. There's a number of questions there about how did we get people to attend those. There was a mix. Some of the happy hours, we recorded not a webinar, we recorded like a 1-minute video to promote and invite people to attend. Others were simply shared via the program, and at the end of every session, for the end of the day, we would say, hey, we'll see you back here tonight at 8 o'clock Eastern if you want to join this virtual session. But again, Zoom fatigue and the time zone spread, I think, contributed to that lower participation, although the folks that were there were very happy with those sessions and they were very highly rated. So I'm not one to say that because fewer people come, it's not a success. It was really important, especially virtual sessions or happy hours that were affinity group by identity. So leaders of color happy hour, young professionals happy hour. It was hugely helpful, I think, for those folks. And we did get great feedback on that. In terms of the session, 90 minutes, many our live sessions were 90 minutes, and we did not see a lot of drop off across the length of those. So even though it seems long, because all of our interactive sessions really included a lot of, or all of our live sessions included a lot of interactivity, folks engaged through the end. You want to go ahead, Brenna? Next. So a couple of key things that we found helpful is helping the participants navigate the conference site. We recorded a welcome video, and this is how you navigate the conference. That was appreciated in the evaluations and got a lot of views. Also, just at the top of every Zoom session, we help folks navigate the chat and the polls, etc., the names. I think that's less important now that all of us are all too familiar with Zoom. We did support the presenters. There was a lot of hesitation. Some folks had never recorded a session. So, you know, just like assigning a staff person that they can work with. Some folks just had it down and said, look, I'll be ready when I show up. Others needed 2 or 3 meetings ahead of the live session to really feel comfortable. And as Merrick's was saying, if you're doing a recording, even if it's a 20-minute recording, make sure they've got 90 minutes. You don't hit record until they're comfortable. And if you have to restart, then we restart. So getting folks, the presenters themselves, comfortable with it. We did have a lot of that, a lot of staffing on during the live sessions, 2 to 3 staff that served as hosts, chat monitor, poll monitor, IT assistants. So that was super helpful. And I can't imagine doing a live session with less than 2 staff people assigned to it on the day of. And then promoting networking. It's come up across the chat comments. It was harder because the chat function of our platform was not very user-friendly. It was difficult for us to promote the networking on the conference site. But I will say that whatever platform you select, assigning somebody to monitor it from the very start of the day to the very end of the day, because there were chat comments coming in throughout the day. And so making sure that there's somebody there to respond. Other ways of promoting networking, as we were saying, happy hours, affinity groups, and limiting some of those ancillary events that we described earlier, the birding and other such events. So successful workshops. There are some resources we'll share that I hope are helpful to you, but we definitely promoted with all of the live session presenters to incorporate a lot of this interactivity. So, well, I should say to promote particular workshops and make sure that we had good attendance. We were promoting them in the chat rooms in the conference site. We were sending emails. For us, it was twice a week, but an email daily, if you're doing a more compressed 3-day event, would be helpful to let folks know what's coming up that day. On social media, and every time we closed out a session, we would announce what was coming up next or what was coming up later in the day. In terms of, you know, the workshops that we selected to be live workshops, we really gave a lot of thought to who were the speakers, because engaging speakers are everything. We had sessions where the speaker did not want to incorporate any breakout rooms, any chat discussions, and yet because they were so dynamic, those sessions just were amazing. So really thinking about how dynamic those presenters are in a Zoom world, it makes a huge difference. And then some tips there for including, for promoting inclusivity and inclusion, you know, promote the use of pronouns and video backgrounds and help people navigate that in a Zoom setting. We tried to control whether participant cameras were on or off. At the end, we just said, let's leave them on, because you would have people popping in and out when it was a Zoom meeting. So we gave up on trying to control that. And then really promoting some of these poll chat box breakouts. The chat box to ask questions, as we've been doing during this session, get the answers out, and then creating a resource that's shared back out, as we will do after today's session, is hugely helpful because there's a lot of wisdom in the room. In terms of the breakouts, we certainly learned what worked and what didn't. Hosting a breakout early in a 90-minute session is a lot better. What we found is that if the presenters were doing their whole presentation and then at the very end you were allowing for breakout groups to process that information, between, you know, the large group, and by the time we broke it up into breakouts, people refused the invitation and just dropped off the webinar or the meeting altogether. So what was more helpful is within the first 10 minutes, allow for some breakout, even if it's in groups of 2 or 3, to introduce each other and come back to the large group. And thereafter, then it was much more engaging and it was more useful. Provide ample time for breakouts. Don't do too many. Make sure there's enough time, because it takes people a minute to introduce themselves as they get to the breakout and to start on whatever the prompt is that you shared with them, to start on that discussion, and keep those simple. Same with the report outs. We tried to use the chat box to track the report outs from the small group discussions, and it was challenging, because if it was a meaty conversation, somebody was typing in for 10 minutes before, you know, before you could turn your attention and read their comments, the presentation had moved on. So just be really conservative in what you expect from those report outs from the breakouts, and encourage a facilitator who at least will get people going to say, okay, let's dive into this question, let's introduce each other. Otherwise there was precious minutes were wasted as people were just sort of feeling their way out through the breakout. You want to go to the next slide? And so then just finally, this is, at the end of the day, this is the feedback. Our evaluations, yes, it was challenging for us to get evaluations. We got a lot fewer than we would in a live event, but the evaluations we did get, which was about 60, the overall feedback, and when we look at the goals we're trying to meet in hosting Rally, they were met. 96% of the live sessions were highly rated, and I've got information in there. You can compare the evaluations of 2020 Rally versus the 19 Rally, which was in person. And in terms of people who felt highly connected to one another or likely to apply the knowledge, they were pretty close. We did ask, would you consider attending a future virtual Rally? If not for COVID reasons, at least for the carbon footprint. And we got an 82% said yes. I don't know what that would look like today in July, but back in May and June, when people weren't attending as many of these virtual events, that was the feedback. And we did hear some of the positives is just richer content, ability to engage. You get to see the speaker in their living room, and it creates a certain level of intimacy that promotes conversation in a way that otherwise would not happen. So that's basically it. If you want to turn quickly, Brenna, to the last question. And I would say we are at the top of the hour, so I don't know if we won't have time to answer any other questions, but if you have questions that we haven't been able to respond to yet, please add them to the chat box, and we will do our best to incorporate our responses into the document that you will receive at the end after this session. So yes, crowdsourced wisdom, if you've got any other input for how to build interactivity, we'd love to hear it. So
Great.
Brenna, back to you to wrap it up.
Thanks, Deanna, and thanks everyone for sharing so much of your information and the questions in today's webinar. Again, we have a whole list of resources that we have mentioned and touched on today. We are going to share these resources out with you per this at the end of this meeting. So stay tuned for that. We are also going to compile a resource from all of the information that you provided in the chat box, as well as a recording of this. So please take a minute to fill out the evaluation and the link that I've sent you. Our final one of these types of roundtable sessions will be on August 26th. So if you are interested in continuing this series with us, please feel free to register for that event. And then also, as we are planning for our fall series, we have a quick survey. It's one question asking you, what do you want to hear about in the fall of 2020? So thank you all so much again for taking the time today, and be well and stay tuned for all the resources that we'll be sending your way.